this together. I think when you said you were surprised that your Facebook group, Unfundamentalist Children's Ministry, has over 1,000 people, I would have to say I'm not surprised at all. I think it's a growing demographic. Dave's known this for a long time. I jumped at the opportunity to interview you, Dave, because I've known you for a while, certainly since the beginning of my career in this space, this open progressive space. You have been a champion of that, of trying to get progressive, open-minded children's ministry leaders together and in conversation, and parents. And so you've supported my work. I've had the opportunity to read yours. So it's just a really great synergy and conversation. So excited to have you. So we're talking about your book, Little Theologians. Do you have, can you hold it up to the screen for people?
Yeah, absolutely. I came prepared.
There you go. So there's the cover. The reason I asked him to hold up his is that I went full nerd and put my so that I could highlight and put Post-its on it and really study it. It really is the type of book that you want to study. I think you will put Post-its and underlines in yours. It's more of an academic book with an academic press, and you can talk a little bit about that. So we thought that we just start out by asking you to give us just a little tour of it, the research, the communities that you study, just kind of an overview of it, just for those who haven't read it yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks. I was thrilled, first of all, Bonnie, when you approached me and said, hey, we've never done anything like this on this page. You know, I'm excited about the book coming out. What do you think? And then even more excited when you said, Tracy's agreed to do the interview. So I feel like I'm in great company with the two of you and with everyone else who's here as well. Yeah, so Little Theologians really started, I have to say, in 2008 or 2009 in its most embryonic of forms. And it, at the time I was living in Virginia, in Richmond, Virginia, capital of the Confederacy. And I was born and raised in Northern Ontario. I had been living in Southern Ontario for a while before moving to Virginia. And it was an eye-opening experience for me. It was much more, you know, as a Canadian, I grew up on a lot of, especially Michigan, a lot of US, but specifically Michigan media. And so I was shocked to live in that space because it was like anyone else. It was more of a culture shock, right? Living internationally. And there were things that challenged me specifically around race and the history of race, especially in Richmond, that were really difficult for me.
To click.
And a colleague of mine said, you know, when you go back to Canada, you know, you as an outsider to this context, you can see things that other people can't see because it's not your, to quote Canada's national anthem, it's not your home and native land. And so when you go back to yours, look for those spaces that you have been socialized as a white male not to see in your own context. And I became really, I took that really seriously. And so when I started my PhD at the Toronto School of Theology, I became really interested in issues of interculturalism, of post-colonial theology and practice, and of cultural diversity. So that's kind of the backstory. I married all of that with an existing interest I had in ministry and formation with young people. So that's how this project got off the ground. So what I ended up doing is I spent about a year and a half in getting involved and doing research, qualitative research with children and with congregations within the United Church of Canada. And you know, offline, Tracy and I have been chatting, and we were talking about, you know, why United Church of Canada. Well, for one thing, it was an access it was an access thing. There are 7 colleges at the Toronto School of Theology, and my home college was the United Church College, even though I'm not a member of the United Church of Canada. But the other thing is that they, in 2006, they took a very early step, but before a lot of other people and a lot of other denominations, to create and adopt a document called a transformative vision for the United Church of Canada. That was essentially their vision for how they can become an intercultural church. And I want to explain that idea of intercultural, because that's really crucial to the book, to the research, and to the whole context. And it's used differently. So Canada, you know, I was a multicultural poster child. I grew up, Csinos is a Hungarian name. It's actually pronounced Csinos in Hungarian. And I grew up knowing about my Hungarian roots. I went to the local Hungarian club, and that was all kind of in the 80s and the 90s, and it was the heyday of Canadian multiculturalism. Interculturalism in a Canadian context is a move away from some of the criticisms of multiculturalism. So essentially the food and festivals, we're not going to go too deep and talk about structural racism or xenophobia or anything like that, because well, number one, we're polite Canadians. And number two, because it's hard work. So interculturalism dives into that. And it says, no, we need to go beyond the kind of sanitized cultural diversity that has been promoted in this context, and dive into recognizing the dynamics at play in really arguing that the public realm is shared and contested among multiple cultural contexts and identities. So what I did is I explored, I kind of took the United Church's lead, and I had some contacts and found 4 churches that self-identified culturally in different ways and were willing to be part of this study. Now, when I mean culturally, they are all racially and ethnically different from one another, but they are also economically different, geographically different. You know, they have different budgets, different sizes, different, some are urban, suburban, rural. And so it's a very broad view of culture, not just as a synonym for ethnicity or race. So, and I spent time at each of the churches. I interviewed children, I interviewed leaders, and I really wanted to get a sense of how children make theological meaning in context of in different cultural contexts. How does the way that they generate their theological ideas, how is it reflective of their broader congregational culture, and how does it diverge? So for a very brief overview of the book, it's 8 chapters. The first 4 chapters are kind of a dive into each of those congregations. So we start with a congregation that is intentionally trying to become intercultural and is urban and fairly historic in a North American perspective. I see Mary Hawes is here, and you know, she probably laughs at our historic churches that are 190 years as she's going to church at a, you know, 1,200-year-old building. But so that's one. Another one is a congregation primarily made up of immigrants and second-generation Canadians from Ghana, and that was a completely different cultural context. The third is a predominantly white church, and the fourth is an Indigenous congregation. And so what I did is I looked at how I got a sense of how children are making theology, how they are creating theological ideas, how they're communicating them. And for each of those chapters, I explore how they're similar to their congregations, and also where they kind of theological excursions, essentially where they take their own paths, because they're not just parroting theology in their culture. They're human beings that are doing things in their own way. Chapter 5 is, there isn't a lot of work out there about culture and children and theology in this way. And so what I did is I actually kind of put them all alongside each other and explore both, to use a phrase from another scholar, how the children are like all others. Essentially, what are the universal aspects I saw in all the children? How they're like some others. So what are the cultural aspects I saw? And how they're like no other. So what are some examples of how this child's theology is completely unique to them and not shared among any of the other, 19 children that participated in this? And then in the next two chapters, I rather than go from theory to practice, I kind of go from practice and I say, what if these children speak back to the broader cultures in which they're operating? So one chapter looks at the United Church and its vision for becoming intercultural. And we see that the children and their congregations actually provide some correctives or push them even further into new avenues for becoming intercultural. In chapter 7, I look at other research in the world of children's spirituality and explore, again, how do these particular children speak back to this academic community that is studying them and people like them. And then in chapter 8, I explore some avenues for new questions that arose, avenues for new research, and perhaps most importantly for this group, ideas for further practice. So if you're a practitioner, what does all of this stuff that I talk about, what does that mean for how we engage in faith formation and with ministry with children? So that's 200 pages in far too many minutes.
No, you did a great job. I think, zooming way out, you and I have talked before about the fact that it's so important to be informed by research and by, what's going on, how do we make decisions about these very practical things, right? So the people on this call, in large part, live in a very practical space, trying to do practical things with children on a daily basis. And so, I think that in the very first few pages, you say something to the effect of, children aren't, they're not just like passive sponges of theology, they're actively doers of theology. And I think that is something that resonates so strongly with this community. I can't imagine anybody working with children in a religious context for longer than 2 months and not coming to that conclusion themselves. We know this. If we work with children, we know that they do theology, they make theology. I was really just enchanted by so much in the book that cracked me up in terms of how you were doing this process, and you are in one sense sort of like this observer, you're writing this very academic book, and then other state you like go to the churches and the person's like, so how about you take this crowd of kids, and you're like, oh, I'm teaching, it's like you go to like, study the baby and someone's like, can you change a diaper while you're here? And so, you're like actually getting in there with the kids while you're studying them. And then just again, for people that haven't read the book yet, I mean, there's just a whole rich, you actually go type in word for word, many of the conversations that you have, what you said, what they said, what you said, how you interjected. I thought you're very careful and fair to not just summarize and not just make conclusions. I really appreciated that you were trying to connect the dots, but that you weren't doing that in an irresponsible way. You were saying like, look, these are threads that I see, but I'm not making this blanket statement that kids think X, Y, or Z about God. Right. And so one of the things that I thought would be interesting for you to speak to a little bit, and I'll show you how I did it with my own kids and ask for your feedback. But what if some of the people around the table or on this call wanted to do their own little investigation of their community and see, how would they go about, what kinds of things did you have in your mind as a researcher when you were asking questions so that you didn't lead them? Your questions are very much following their lead. How did you do that? How did you do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I want to throw out two resources to begin with. One of them is one that I use when I teach. We have a required kind of final year qualitative research course at Atlantic School of Theology, because we firmly believe that good pastors are actually good qualitative researchers, meaning we are looking at what is going on in our communities. We're trying to understand, at our best, we're trying to understand what's going on, why it's happening, so that we can respond. So one of the books I use, it's a little over 10 years old now, by Mary Clark Michella. It's called Ethnography as a Pastoral Practice. And it essentially takes a lot of the ideas and practices of qualitative researchers and says, how do we as pastors do this within our own congregations? The other one that was really inspiring for me was a classic from 1990, Robert Coles' book, The Spiritual Life of Children. And that was the third in this series that he wrote. And I really took inspiration from Coles in his ability to just listen closely to the children that he's talking to about spiritual matters. The funny thing is, for that book, he talks about how, yeah, he did some new interviews and things like that, but he had a lifetime of interviewing children, and he drew from it. So when he's talking about the spiritual matters that children hold dear and their inner lives, he's doing so relying on research that he did that was not actually about those things, but it came through. And so the danger for me was going to be to have two prescribed questions that immediately guided the children one way or another, especially when I want to know where they take me. That's the thing, is I really just kind of put them in the driver's seat, literally telling them that, yes, I'm the adult in this room with you, but you're the teachers, and this is something Coles does. You're the teachers, I'm the student, and this is what I want you to teach me. I want to learn this about you. And so what I did is, instead of going with certain questions, I went with packs of pencil crayons and pieces of paper. And I gave all the children, sometimes I interviewed small groups of children, sometimes one-on-one. And I gave them all pencil crayons and a paper, and said, I would like you to draw me a picture of God. And that's it. There were no prescribed questions. In my pilot study, I realized one thing that was really helpful to get a sense from them was what they felt was really important about their church. So it ended up that at some point, we usually got into things about their life at their church. And so there inevitably would be a conversation about what, if they had to describe their church to someone that knew nothing about it, what would you say? And there were different ages, different cultures, so it had to be worded differently. I think one of my favorite moments that always makes me laugh, because it was a mistake on my part, because I had a very young child. I think he was 6 years old, and they think more concretely. Abstract words and language don't mean the same thing. And so he was talking about his grandfather, and how I said, has your grandfather ever been to this church? And I thought, perfect, this is a great way to get into this conversation. And I said, so if your grandfather said, could you tell me about your church, what would you say? Now, his answer was, I would say, okay, Grandpa. But that's exactly what I was asking him. What would you say? Would you tell me? Okay, I would tell you. So the language I used had to change, because I had to say, well, what are the kind of things that you would tell him?
Yes.
Whereas the 9-year-olds would have known, the 12-year-olds would have known, you're actually asking me to imagine this with you. Anyway, yeah, so lots of interesting
I love
scenarios
it. So
that happen.
I think everybody should do it with their churches. Give kids in your church, pencils and colored pencils and paper, and just ask them to draw a picture of God. I loved these pictures in here. I loved reading about them. We're not going to give all the spoilers away. We want you to read the book, but that's it. Their pictures are in there with very clear descriptions of what the children said about them. So I did this with my children, and I because I had a stack of books and I was telling my kids what I was reading, and then I said, hey, would you help me with this? So I wanted to show you because I knew that you would care.
Awesome.
Yeah. So my and I did what you did, and I wrote down exactly what they said. So this is my 8-year-old's drawing, and so the thing that he's told to me. So this is God, and God's up in the clouds, and then down here is a person. And the thing that you will love is that he says, you know that God is not a man or a woman because there's no eyebrows, and men have bushy eyebrows and women don't. And the thing that fits, I think, with our family culture is my husband is Colombian, and I'm European American. So any eyebrows that you see on me are painted on. I don't very much eyebrows. So in our family, the boys have eyebrows and the girls don't. And so along those lines, my son Clayton did this one.
Yeah.
He said that God is half man and half woman. So that's why there's like hair on one side. And then he said, these lines are like the glass in our church, the stained that shine out.
That's beautiful.
Something about the 4 corners and the sash that I didn't really understand. But he had some ideas about that. And then these are sandals because God wears sandals, which to me was Jesus wearing sandals. But it was such a blast. And I was thinking like, oh, kids, all of these Christian educators in our group should do this. Have a little moment with your kids and try to learn. Another piece that I thought was interesting, and I was wondering if you could speak to it a little bit. For me, I don't know if I would have thought, I think I would have been worried about like tainting the data and having the kids talking together. But I really loved, and at several points, you talked about how the children kind of connected and played off of their theology, just like we're doing now, right? To me, that was such an eye-opener, like, well, of course children make theology with each other because that's what everybody does. That's what grown-up too. How do you look at that, and how do you encourage all of us to help children do theology together in groups?
Yeah. Well, I think the hardest thing, or one of the more difficult things about doing that kind of drawing with a child, whether you are in a pastoral or paid or volunteer, whether you're in a church leadership position with them, or whether you're a parent, is that as a researcher, I was neither. And I was there to learn about what they thought. I grew to care about these children, some of them, especially in the Indigenous congregation. There's the people in that congregation said, in Canada, the Indigenous community is the most over-researched community, but they benefit the least.
Yes.
And so it was like a year to a year and a half of not doing, what I say in another article I write is between yes and no. They always said, well, we're not saying no, or we're not saying yes, you can do this research with us yet, but we're still not ready to say no. So I built relationships with these children in different ways at different churches. But at the end of the day, my relationship with them was not as a pastoral leader or as a parent. It was as a term I use in some other work, like a co-pilgrim. Like it was really just someone who's there to walk along with them. And the hardest thing I think to do is to not worry about where they're going, and not worry about if it's correct, if what they're saying is correct or incorrect and things like that. Because one of the things I learned from this is that children are not bringing theology with them into this process. When we have conversations, whether it's Sunday school or a research project, they're not packing their backpack with all their theology coming to church and laying it out for you. It's constructed in that very moment, just like it is for a sermon, right? Or a small group study with adults. We're making meaning together. And one of the things I learned is that there were children who were very eloquent in what they thought, and not necessarily able to actually do the profound work of creating theological meaning. Essentially, they had been socialized into a way of learning the right things. There are other children who, you know, didn't, they were questioning the core doctrines of Christianity that would really make some leaders uncomfortable. I don't think Jesus rose from the dead. I mean, that's a big one. And yet, though their content of their ideas was tenuous, the processes by which they thought about this stuff was really robust. And that, I think, is what we as leaders with children need to find some sort of balance with. Yes, we want children to be able to have, I don't want to say a correct doctrine, but we want them to have beliefs that are loving, that are generous, that are good, that know that God doesn't just love you, God likes you as well. And we don't want children to so you know, if I was doing this as a minister, that would be kind of where my line would be. Like if a child was like, it started getting into like punishment theology and atonement, and I know, Tracy, that's something you and I've talked about as well. I would this kind of substitutionary atonement, or this idea of God and divine wrath for all our mistakes, which some of the children talked about in my research. That's where, as the minister, I would start to do the work of formation to say, well, actually, that's interesting you say that, because I think, you know, that's not the God I know. Like, that's not really my experience of God.
Right.
I wonder where you got, you know, like, what made you think of that? But that's it's a difficult thing to do, to really give them the driver's seat in the conversation, when the discourse in children's ministry is about how do we form them. But the great thing is, when we do give them the driver's seat, they get to form us.
Right.
And it becomes this mutuality between them. So.
Oh, so good. Don't tempt me on the atonement one. I could go.
Part two.
I think you bring up to me, and what you just said, I heard two different strains. The one, and again, like, no surprise that we're focusing on the practical, but that's this group, you know. One is, how are we shepherds of the type of culture, of a certain type of culture with the children that we are ministering to? So one of the, I think it was the first community, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the one community where you said something like, you know, it's clear that in this culture, you know, pushing back and asking questions, that's kind of like the norm. You know, I read that. And in fact, going through the book, for me, I was like, ooh, I would really love to visit that church. And then the next, and then by the time I was like, at the end, I wanted to visit all of these churches. So whether they're all just incredibly cool churches, or you did such a great job of writing about them, you do want to see all of them. But, you know, hearing that, thinking like, yeah, well, what am I doing or not doing to create that sort of culture for the kids in my care? And then the second piece is like, so there's like the, you know, what's that kind of like smarty pants, like, you know, orthopraxis and ortho, right? Like, you know, so you have like this, you know, these right beliefs, right? And I think you and I and a lot of people on this call maybe bristle against like, well, we're not going to tell you what to say, but we do have limits, right? We're going to push back on a kid that says, you know, I think that God has a big sword and this is God chopping the heads off. I mean, we might be like, oh, something went, well, how are we going to push back on that? So I think we do have this sense of responsibility in some of the things that the actual content of what we're saying. And then the other piece is the culture, and how are we creating a certain type of culture. So in the churches that you studied, that you felt had this sort of culture where children could ask their questions or could kind of be engaging and theological thinkers, because that's one of the things I think, right? Like, if we don't tell children what to think all the time, but kind of teach them how to think, what sort of things did those communities have? Like, what's their secret sauce? And did it come from their, you know, there's the one Ghanaian, mostly Ghanaian, right, congregation, where you're saying like, you know, this culture of interconnectedness is a gift that the the people bring.
Yeah.
What else did you see in those contexts that we could learn from to kind of create the culture that we're hoping for?
Yeah. Well, a couple things really stood out for me. One is, as you've alluded to and said already, is this idea of the children making theology together. I don't think that this is a children's issue. This is a Western Christianity issue. We are our heads on individual bodies. And so there's this individuality that runs throughout a lot of contexts. And one of it ended up being at all of the churches, even though I wanted to, my intention was to do, individual interviews with the children. One of the churches flat out said, nope, it was the intercultural one. They said, because part of being intercultural is focusing on community in amidst our diversity, and we don't do anything individually here. And so if you want to do the research here, and we'd love you to do it, you have to interview them in community as small groups. And thank God they did. Because that was kind of the first instance of seeing that there's something else going on here. They aren't, even though they're making it's not just that they're making theology together, it's that they're holding this communal theology that might in fact be a little bit different than what they individually think. The way, and you can see in some of the transcripts of the interviews and some of the excerpts, the way that they riff off each other and the way that they allow one another's ideas to shape their own thoughts. It ended up being just because, they were siblings or one reason or another. I ended up doing some interviews at other churches with two, more than one child as well. And the same dynamics were often at play there. So although it was really evident at that one church because it was part of their culture to do things in community, it happened in other ones. And in the one-on-one interviews, it happened with me. I became the conversation partner and we engaged in that process, and they pushed me to, I left there with new ideas, not just about them, but new ideas about God, about what church looks like, about what the whole point of this faith stuff is. And if I can kind of share a story that is one of my favorites, there were these two boys, I think they were 5 and 10 at the time, from this intercultural church. And one of them wrote or drew the picture that ended up being chosen for the cover. And that boy who drew the picture on the cover, he said, I heard one time that there's this old saying that whenever you lie, God throws a lightning bolt at you that you can't see. And again,
that's kind of true.
One of those moments of, I would deal with this differently as a minister. And the other boy, it wasn't I can't even put it in the book as a transcript, because it was the younger boy just kept coming back to that as we started talking about other things. And it was like, we've moved on, but he's bringing us back to that. And eventually because it didn't match his experience. It didn't match what he thought.
Yeah.
He said, I've lied before, but I've never been hit by lightning. So that can't be true.
It can't be true. Yeah.
But instead of just discounting it as it's not true, he actually expanded the boundaries of his own theological imagination. Because in the end, what he ended up landing on is this idea of, wait a minute, what if the lightning bolt isn't a divine punishment because you lied, but it's a warning to let you know that you've lied and don't do, and so he said, maybe I haven't been hit by lightning because I know when I lie. So God doesn't need to remind me, you're lying there, don't forget. And it just transformed his understanding of God and of all that stuff in light of this conversation that he was having with another child.
I love it so much. That's what I was thinking when you said that. It's a light that you can't see. It's like something in your own.
Yeah, Yeah, and it's so I think when it comes to pastoral practice, that's a big one for me, is not getting out of the way. That's not the language I would want to use. Even though now I think about it, I'm like, I hope I didn't say that in the book. But it's more about getting in the process with them.
Yeah.
But we do get out of the way from, we allow our preconceptions, we allow our kind of prescribed ideas of what we want to do to take a back seat. And we don't need to do this all the time. That's not what I'm saying. But it would be helpful for pastoral practice with children if we do have these moments, whatever they might look like, where we join them in just letting our theological imaginations go wild. Not to help them land at what they think, but also to help them learn how to theologically think. I think one of the big issues underlying a lot of what's going on in the world is that a lot of people don't actually know how to think, and how to engage with ideas that are different than their own, while allowing their own ideas to be, I think Brian McClaren calls it like a strong benevolent faith, strong enough that your faith isn't going to crack, that your faith is going to break, but flexible enough that it can make room for difference and diversity without saying, if you think this and I think this, one of us has to be wrong. And we need to let children practice and engage with and show us how it's done at times.
That's so timely, Dave. It's like so timely. Do you know Deneen Akers? She wrote the Okay, yeah. So Deneen and I were just texting just today. Do you know Jennifer Grant? Maybe God is like that.
By name.
Okay, so the three of us were on a sort of text train just today talking about this exact issue. Like, okay, you know, they were talking about this movie, the social something, some thing about that's apparently very scary about social networking and AI and how it's like, I don't know, but I haven't seen it, but I've told them that I would. But we were sort of saying like, okay, what's everybody's collective responsibility? Like, and anybody that writes in this space for children now, how can we talk about with children this exact idea, you know, understanding what's dialogue, understanding, you know, because all of us, every single person on this call in this past week has no doubt experienced some Facebook comment, some Twitter comment where one person's just saying like, you know, I can't talk to this type of person, or this is ignorance, or this is, you know, and everybody, and then we get into like both sidesism, and we do talk about true justice, but how do you talk, how do you listen is so timely. And if we can practice it in the church, if we can make it a spiritual value, a value of listening and questioning. I mean, I don't know what you think, but I think that one of the areas in the church where we kind of mess this up is around the time of adolescence. If, you know, adolescents in our faith communities start pushing back and rejecting the community, and, you know, like you were talking about, like, ooh, that really big leap of the one child who's like, well, Jesus wasn't raised from the dead. A lot of times, you know, in adolescence, that's when that comes through. And if we really mess that up and start flipping out, you know, like, oh no. And I read that and see so much language about that. Like, people ask me, or they'll write about like, how do we keep people from straying from the faith, or how do we keep them, you know? And it's like, well, part of the answer, I think, is that you have a place where we're not going to spaz out if somebody that we don't find orthodox, children or adults, right? So if we practice this when kids are little, if they say like, well, I don't think Jesus did raise from the dead, instead of being like, ooh, how do we correct it? How do we open up the brain and put in the thing we want in there? How do we create a culture around it? And I think the communities, I keep saying it, but the communities that you highlighted, I mean, I was just like, where did these churches come from? They're so gorgeous and have this really neat, these neat cultures kind of naturally. So, but we're getting to a time where we wanted to open up to questions. So I'll let you speak to that. And while you're doing, let's invite people to put your questions in the chat. And this is just a warning and a threat that if you don't put questions, keep yammering on. So please put questions in so that we can ask Dave to answer what we want for him. Yeah, go.
Yeah, there's so much I want to say in response, and I agree with what you're saying. The only thing I disagree with is that, well, yes, I agree with you. These are beautiful congregations.
Yeah.
They are normal congregations.
Yeah.
That's the other thing, is
right.
like they're all unique, but so are all of your congregations. That's one of the things I hold so central to my assumptions in this project, is that a congregation is a cultural context, one of many competing for the attention in our lives, competing for our fidelity and the right to shape us. And and I hope if you are going to, do some of that, ethnographic research, armchair ethnography of your own congregation, you will see some of the beautiful, not so beautiful things too.
Yes, right.
These congregations had that, but you'll see some beautiful things that you didn't see before.
You're such a professor, Dave. I was like, so what's a like, really nice practical resource these people can have? And your answer was ethnography as a because like, really? Okay.
Well, okay, because I've got to quote someone else too. I think it's no, hey, it's a compliment. I think it's Wesley Allen in one of his books talks about the idea of he's a homiletician, and one of his books he talks about preaching and conversation, and he highlights that conversation is not conversion.
Right.
That's one of the things that's really difficult or we need to kind of separate, right? Sometimes when we have conversation inside and outside the church, there's this sense that we are trying to convert the other person to think our way. But in so doing, we become closed to hearing what the other person is saying in their own right, rather than just trying to convince the other person to adopt our way of life or our way of thinking. The other thing is, a lot of this depends on what we understand as important to the journey of faith. And unfortunately, the result of the Enlightenment for, and the hundreds of years of since the start of the Enlightenment is the intellectualization of belief, right? Just take, for example, some more conversional churches that have a sinner's prayer, right? And it's, do you believe that Jesus did this, and do you believe these things? Other churches, right? Do you believe in, we say the Apostles' Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. But faith is more than that. And I think I was going somewhere really good with this. I think the thing is, that when we see faith as more than that, as you said, as part of community and belonging as well, it's different. There's this study that came out a few years ago from St. Mary's Press, where they looked at Catholic young adults and teenagers who left the church. And the coolest thing about it, it's a small little book called Going, Going, Gone. But the cool thing about it is it was an online study. And so they, word for word, with poor grammar and emojis and bad capitalization, they have in the back this long appendix of every response from every participant. And when you read through the responses, you see there are a lot of people, and this is not a Catholic thing, it just happens to be in this study. There are a lot of young people who leave the church because they say, I don't know if I believed XYZ, XYZ, sorry, Canadian. And I apologize, of course, I apologize.
Sorry.
And or it's, I don't believe X, these certain things. Therefore, that's why I left. It's heartbreaking to think that if you don't cognitively or intellectually believe a certain thing, you feel like you can't
get booted out.
Community. So we need to focus on community as well, and on saying, you can think differently, you can reject us, we're not rejecting you.
Right. Oh,
you're still one of us.
Yeah, man, that'll preach. Okay, so we do have two questions and we're running out of time here, so I want to get some. Sarah says, What advice do you have for how to teach our volunteer teachers to move from telling kids what to think to teaching them how to think? For many people who have taught and volunteered with kids for decades, this won't come naturally to them. So how do we do that practically, very practically speaking?
Practically, I think you get a bunch of people together, get your volunteers together, give them a piece of paper and some pencil crayons, and you say, draw a picture of God, and we're going to talk about this.
Yeah.
And then maybe you do an intergenerational group where you have teenagers, kids, and adults together, and you model for them without saying, I'm going to model this for you, but you just do it. That to me is the biggest eye opener that I can imagine right now, is to actually see it happen, to see the power behind children's thoughts and imaginations, and to see what it looks like for an adult to really come alongside a young person as someone who has as much authority and wisdom and value and connection with God as one another. Yeah.
I agree 100%. And I would add to that, I think, you know, one of the practical things we can do is to model doubts as leaders, you know, to not have a doubt be some sort of a taboo thing, but something that is just natural, something that we talk about, something that we lift up, something that almost is almost something to be encouraged and embraced as something that makes our faith stronger. And then I just wanted to mention this one resource just because I think you'll find it really interesting, Dave, and for the people watching. If you Google East versus West infographics, has nothing to do with faith in particular. Have you ever seen that? Have you seen this? It's this.
I don't know.
And she has these infographics about the way culturally, the way we understand different concepts. So like community, you know, she'll have a drawing, or like a party, and in the West, everybody's in the circle, and in the East, the people are in small groups. I think I really commend that to just as a shortcut for talking so much. And you can show those to different kids and to grown-ups and talk about it. Okay.
Yeah, I just to follow up on that other question though, I think the reason I'm suggesting that is also because this is a new thing for adults as well.
Yes.
Right? We've been socialized in a different way often. I'm not saying, you know, one thing in the book is that culture is, so, you know, Christianity is diverse from place to place. And but for a lot of people who have been raised in a Western, especially a dominant culture, Western perspective, we have to get used to this and get comfortable with it for ourselves, and get our volunteers comfortable with it.
That's such a great, that's such a great practical suggestion, to get your volunteers together and, you know, ask them what they think about the culture and so forth. Okay. So another one on the practical, can you speak more on your chapter/section of practical application? Is there a suggestion of application virtually versus in person? I know we're all thinking about how to do all of these things virtually.
That's a tough one. And I think one of the more challenging aspects of doing ministry with young people virtually is different uses of technology, different access to technology, different expectations, right? There are some children who are much more, you know, who grew up with an iPhone in their hand, and others that grew up and had an iPhone added to them later in particular ways, right? I think it'd be really interesting to see about how do we, I have become a much stronger proponent of family-based ministry because of the pandemic, because first of all, it matters no matter what. And I have, there's a great book called Faithful Families with ideas for how to do that.
Heard about that.
Yeah, absolutely. But this is the perfect time to do that kind of thing, because families or households, right, are together. I think there are also ways of doing this in small groups digitally. I know different social media sites can become spaces for this, and for some people, the technology actually becomes a a gift to them. I have a colleague who once told me about, a couple of years ago, before any of us knew how online our lives would become. She said, I joined a small group, like a Christian kind of small formation group, virtually for the first time. And she said, it's the best group I've ever been part of, because there's something about the virtual experience that allows people to interact in a different way. It's almost like the screen. Yes, there are elements of the screen that separate us from each other, but there are also elements that allow us to become more vulnerable in particular ways for some people. So, yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, I've been kind of on, and I'm not picking on you because we all do it, but I've been kind of getting grouchy about people even using the word virtual to describe these experiences, right? Like, people will say, oh, well, join us for virtual church, right? And it's like, it's not actually virtual church, it's online church, but it's not a virtual church experience. It actually is church, like what we're doing is not like a virtual interview. I'm actually grilling you on. So we have one question. I think Nancy's the one that asked it. So Nancy, I'm going to ask you to be on guard in case Dave needs clarification. But she writes, I find value in bringing spiritual practices into children, youth, and young adult ministries. So many times God is far beyond our mental reach, which we may have the intimation of and not the language around. I have your book and have not read it. Does any of your research include orthopraxy?
Great question. So this specifically, I'm 100% with you. And I have done other writing that talks about that, the idea of issues around language, human language to articulate, non-human, non-material, supernatural, extraordinary things. That is why Christianity is essentially, David Mallet talks about Christianity as metaphorical. He talks about, if someone says, oh, I'm thinking about going into ministry, he's like, what's a good question to ask? I think it would be, I don't know, maybe you would be a good minister. Do you like metaphor? Because that's what your life is going to be. And
that stings, and it's true though.
Yeah, exactly. This project specifically was about children's theological ideas. As a practical theologian, I am a big believer in theology that is lived and experienced, theology that is understood and thought, and the way the two interact with and overlap each other, right? We don't just have our ideas and then practice them. We don't just have our practices and then they become ideas. The two intermingle, right? This was focused specifically not on children's practices, but on children's theological thinking, but also their practices for theological thinking and how their congregational practices inform that as well. So it is focused more on the ideas side over the practice side of children's thinking. But that's also why I started with a drawing, because the drawing became an avenue for starting to put words together, or put words to something that really is beyond words. It's another way of communicating theological insight, not just through what is drawn, but through how you talk about the drawing. Through some of the children were talking as they drew, and if we hadn't had that conversation, their drawing might have looked differently, and some of them, you could tell, adapted their drawings to incorporate some of the things that we were talking about in that space. So I think that's also why drawing is really helpful for children, especially because it is putting a different medium, or a different medium by which they can put something concrete to something that is really abstract.
100%. I mean, I could talk offline about this all day probably, because I am so firmly rooted in the practice. But then, as I go forward in this, kind of life and start talking about other things and getting into more deeper, issues Easter and atonement and all of these things, at what point, you know, you can't just have this sort of like abstract practice that's not informed by, you know, this other scaffolding. And if we could, we definitely could keep talking. So someone said, thank you for this conversation. I'd like more conversation on the topics of the last 15 mintes. Well, I guess that means we have to do a part 2 sometime, Dave.
Yeah. The only thing I would add off the top of my head is going back to the question about the virtual versus in person. One of the other things I learned just from that I think is important to incorporate into the practice of ministry is to there were instances in which what was happening with children in the church and what was happening in the wider church were actually out of sync with one another. And so there's one church specifically that is like, we want people to think for themselves. We don't want people to turn their brains off. But then you go to children's ministry, and for the younger kids, they use Godly Play. And, you know, it's not a perfect resource, but it is certainly more open to that idea of thinking for yourself. It encourages that. And it is a great resource. And the younger children who were using Godly Play could do that kind of work. But the older children who didn't have Godly Play, who didn't grow up with it, and who grew up with a more, you know, the curriculum says, this is the question and here's the answer. They were the ones that struggled to make theological meaning for themselves. And it actually was not in line with what the ministers and the leaders were saying they wanted to have happen in the whole church, not just with children. So one thing to do, and I think maybe the move to online is because of the disruptive nature of it, it might give us an edge here, that it's important to examine our church. What, you know, and the question to ask is, if you had to describe your church to someone who wasn't part of it, what would you say? It says a lot about what is important to a church community. What are the norms and values and visions of what makes this community? And then how is your ministry with children in line with that? How does it need to change to be better aligned? And maybe how does what you do in ministry with children need to kind of push along and disrupt some of the wider culture of the church? And I think, again, we do have the opportunity to do that because we are out of our norms.
Absolutely. And asking that question with adults and children together and separately, it seems like there's value in both of those. Well, Dave, we're finishing up our time. So Ken, I think we should probably end by you telling us more about how people can connect with you and connect with the book. How can people get the book? Because now they're just dying to read it. If they haven't read it already, they need to read it. So how can people get it? How can people connect with you? Tell us everything.
Yeah, great. Well, you can get the book through the publisher, which is MQUP, McGill Queen's University Press.ca. But you can also get it wherever any other book is sold. Get the paperback or the virtual. The hard copy is from libraries and it's priced accordingly, or the hardback version. You can learn more at my website, davecsinos.com, or faith-forward.net. And at the Faith Forward website, we host a podcast. Every few months, we put out a few new episodes. Tracy, you're on one of them. And it's a great way to stay up to date about what's going on and what are kind of the new other ideas circulating around ministry with children and youth and families.